Good morning, everyone. Getting the last sip of coffee in. All right, today we're going to continue with Chapter 19. We're going to do Part 3. This is our last Ed puzzle of the year. The Pacific War, Part 3 is VJ Day. All right, VJ, if you haven't figured out, is Victory over Japan Day. Now, the Battle of Okinawa is the last major battle of the war, and it is the largest sea, land, and air battle in military history. The island here, it's not very big. It's actually part of mainland Japan. It's the largest island. That's not one of the four main islands, but it's farther south, and the Japanese don't look at it as, even at that time, not sure what they do today, but at the time they don't really look at the people that lived in Okinawa, even though they were Japanese citizens, as being equals to them. Today there's a lot of resorts. I was looking at some photographs. It looks like a real resort island, but in 1945 it was quite different. It's a small island, relatively speaking. It's 66 miles long and only 7 miles wide, though it's a lot bigger than some of the other islands the Americans invaded. It's pretty much similar to Guadalcanal in size, but a lot bigger than, let's say, Tarawa or Saipan. Okay, let's move on here. Now, Shuri Castle. Shuri Castle was built around 1322. It was a palace on the island for the whoever ruled there. Unfortunately, during the battle, it was very heavily damaged. Most of these buildings you see here were destroyed, and they were rebuilt after the war. And there's the photograph of the rebuilt palace after the war. Sadly, there was a major fire here last October, and all these buildings were again destroyed. So they're going to have to rebuild them. Now, here we see Okinawa in relation to Japan. It's about 400 miles south of the main islands. You can see here, let's put a little thing here. So from here up to the main islands, and it's about 950 miles up to Tokyo, which is up here. So you can see it's getting very close to the mainland. So the Japanese, as you can imagine, will defend this quite heavily. All right, I think I got them all out. All right. Now, in relation to what's been going on in the Pacific, Iwo Jima right here. Here we see Iwo Jima, and now they're going to take the next step and going to be getting right here toward Okinawa. And you can see they're getting closer and closer to Japan. Now, it's defended by 107,000 Japanese soldiers, led by a General Mitsuru Ushijima. That's him on the left. That's him in the middle there, pointing out some of the strategies on Okinawa. He's actually considered by many of the military historians as one of Japan's best generals. He was very humane. He wasn't into killing people, and even treating his own men and treating captured prisoners fairly well. So he was actually one of the Japanese officers who wasn't brutal toward other people. Now, in preparation of the invasion, the United States Navy shells the island for a week. They bring in their big battleships. Here's the USS New Jersey firing its 16-inch guns. They were quite impressive when they fired. Now, April 1st, 1945, that's the day they're going to land. This is the largest amphibious assault during the Pacific. Here we see they're still shelling it with one of the battleships. I'm not sure, I think that was the Nevada. It's one of the older battleships shelling the island as these new landing craft. These were called the Water Buffalo. Here they are coming ashore. So they would go through the water, but they had tracks on them. So as soon as they hit the beaches, they could actually move up onto the beaches. And then the men would come out the back, which would kind of protect them from being fired at if the Japanese were firing at them from the while they landed on the beaches. 50,000 Marines will land on the beaches that day. By the end of the battle, it'll be up to 250,000 soldiers. And they were led by a General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. That's quite a name. His, I believe it was his grandfather was a Civil War general. There he is. That's him on the lower right, down here. Okay, that's Buckner. Now, the landings are unopposed. The Japanese stay back and they do nothing. Kind of scaring the Americans as they think that maybe the shelling, maybe the Japanese have left. They don't know what's going on. It's very quiet, very eerie. They start looking around as more and more men come ashore, but they don't know where the Japanese are. The Japanese are there. They've just been told to stay back and wait till the Americans come further inland. Now, as the Americans start moving inland, the Japanese start to fight back, and it is brutal. The fighting is very difficult. The defenders fought from caves. Here we see Marines fighting the Japanese inch by inch, as one Marine said. They had here, it's very hard to pick out in this photograph, but it's actually these Sherman tanks were mounted with flamethrowers like you saw in Iwo Jima. And they would just fire the flamethrowers into caves or where the Japanese were hiding. Now, it was really a battle of attrition. Here we see some Marines passing a dead Japanese soldier. It was a battle of attrition. Whose side will get worn down further? And eventually, the Japanese started to be pushed back and they were starting to lose. It would take 82 days to capture the island. But finally, it was done on June 22nd, 1944. The Americans here are celebrating. And of course, it was proclaimed all around the world. Daily news, Japs give up by the thousands in Okinawa. That really wasn't true. They weren't giving up by the thousands. But you know, it's the daily news. Now, I want to talk about the Kamikazes. The Kamikazes were brutal, obviously, as they get closer. They would attack and sink or damage 245 ships. Here we see a picture of the youngest Kamikaze, Yukio Araki. He's holding a little puppy there. He's only 17 years old. This was a picture taken of him before they flew off to crash their planes into the American ships. Here we see the planes being prepared for their kamikaze missions. They had a ritual ceremony beforehand. Even the schoolgirls would wave as they start taking off to die for the emperor. Now on the American side, they would damage many of the ships or sink. This was the USS Franklin. 725 were killed on board. When I was growing up, I worked with a guy who was actually a sailor on board the Franklin. His arms still had the burn scars from this. But 725 died on the Franklin. The USS Bunker Hill was hit by a kamikaze. 389 were killed on board. So it was really, really, it wasn't good. It was scary. Casualties were very high on Okinawa. 18,900 U.S. soldiers were killed. That's twice the death rate on Iwo Jima plus Guadalcanal, and over 50,000 were wounded. Now, unfortunately, Lieutenant General Buckner was killed. He was one of the highest ranking Americans to die in the war. He was a lieutenant general. They have 3 stars. While he was watching the battle, this was one of the last photographs taken of him. While they were watching the battle, a shell exploded and he was hit in the chest with some shrapnel, and he died later on. 76,000 Japanese soldiers also died, and they're estimating between 40 and 150,000 civilians killed or committed suicide on the island. Now, they've built what is called the Cornerstone of Peace. It's a monument commemorating the Battle of Okinawa. The names of 241,281 people are inscribed here, Americans and Japanese. Plus, they also have many of these Koreans were forced to fight on the side of the Japanese. So all their names are inscribed on these granite stones here. The United States still has military bases on Okinawa. There are actually 32 military bases run by the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. This includes Kadena Air Force Base. This is the largest and most active U.S. Air Force base in the Far East. This is one of their large E-3 Sentry planes. These fly over. They have communications and radar, and you can see by that thing they have up there on the top, they can kind of see what's going on. Here's a flight of F-15 Eagles flying around Okinawa. The Americans actually do have a large force there, and the military force in Japan, which is there to help defend Japan. This is the logo they have there of the United States and the Japanese with Mount Fuji in the background. Now, 12 days after the Americans invaded Okinawa and landed on the beaches, President Roosevelt passed away, and Vice President Harry Truman becomes president. All right, we ready? We mentioned that when we were talking about Europe, but I want to mention that, obviously it affects the Pacific too. Now, Operation Downfall. Now, the Allies knew the Japanese would not surrender unconditionally and prepared to invade mainland Japan. The U.S. plan to invade Japan would be, of course, we expected help from the Soviets. Not sure if it would come. Now, the first island was Kyushu. This was the southern island of the four, the closest one to Okinawa, so we could make better benefit from the air bases there. And the plan was to invade in November of 1945. The plan then was to invade the second island, the main island of Honshu. This was near Tokyo. And this was the plan to be taking place in March of 1946. Now, the Americans knew the Japanese would fight and not give up. They had fought so desperately on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, not surrendering, the kamikaze attacks, the suicide, and we knew that they would be very desperate. We didn't even know how desperate they were. They were training small children with sharpened bamboo poles to attack American soldiers, so it was really going to be desperate. We expected heavy casualties to invade Japan. The estimates the military had was between 1.7 and 4 million American casualties. Anywhere from 400,000 to 800,000 Americans would be killed on Okinawa. We expected between 5 and 10 million Japanese would die. Now, in context, the invasion of Normandy had 63,000 casualties in the first 48 days. Okinawa had 72,000 casualties, of whom 18,900 were killed. Now, so you can put that compared to the 400,000. In fact, the entire war cost the U.S. a total of just over 1 million casualties with 400,000 dead. So our best estimates would equal all those killed in the Pacific and Europe throughout the entire war added together. That's how much they expected to lose on our invasion of Japan. Now we're going to talk about the Manhattan Project. In 1942, the U.S. decides to develop an atomic bomb, or what we call the A-bomb. It was led by a scientist named Robert Oppenheimer, and the project was very top secret. Very few people knew about it. It was so top secret that even Vice President Harry Truman did not learn about it until after he was sworn in as president. Now, in July 15th of 1945, there is a successful test in New Mexico, and it shows how devastating the bomb can be. Now, Truman knows that the weapon, or he's been told that the weapon can end the war without invading Japan, and this, of course, will save millions of lives. So on July 26, Truman orders that the first bomb to be dropped. Now, there are actually two bombs that will be used. The first one was a uranium-based bomb, and it was nicknamed Little Boy. This will be the one that will be dropped on Hiroshima. The second bomb, which was more powerful, was a plutonium bomb, and this was nicknamed Fat Man. So these are actual casings that they would use for the bombs. They aren't the actual bombs themselves. Now, the first city that was targeted was Hiroshima, also referred to as pronounced Hiroshima. On August 6th at 8:15 a.m., a B-29 dropped the first atomic bomb. Now, the B-29 was called the Enola Gay. This is a photograph of the crew. The pilot, his name was Tibbets, is there in the center smoking a pipe. I did get a photograph of the plane. The plane is today in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum at Dulles Airport, not the one that's in Washington, D.C., with a lunar capsule in the spirit of St. Louis, but this is the one that's out near the airport because they need a very large area. They actually have a one of the shuttlecrafts. So my wife and I, we drove out there, and I got this photograph, along with a lot of other photographs, obviously. Now, when the bomb explodes, 80,000 people in the city die in a flash, and they estimate up to 200,000 died later. This was actually a photograph of the bomb exploding on the mushroom cloud, taken by another plane that was there to photograph and, so they can assess the damage. The bomb destroyed 2/3 of the city. 52 of 55 hospitals were destroyed. Here you can see there's only a few buildings left. Now, one of the buildings that was destroyed was this, it was just a regular building there. They had business conference meetings, a conference center, had the dome on the top, and you can see this is all that was left after the bomb exploded. The Japanese people did not tear this building down, but has actually maintained it as the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. So if you visit the city of Hiroshima, you can see this today. Now, even after the first bomb and they saw the destruction, Japan still does not surrender. 2 days later, on August 8th, Stalin declares war on Japan and they invade Manchuria. Now, keep in mind, this is 3 months after VE Day. Stalin decides he wasn't going to get involved in the war because he saw what Japan was doing. But after the first atomic bomb was dropped, he realized that Japan was going to lose. So I guess he decided to jump in and get part of, what happens after the war. And he will do it. He will get parts of, North Korea, for example. The second city is Nagasaki. On August 8th, a B-29 dropped a second atomic bomb. This was actually a larger one. Fat Man was a larger bomb with a more explosive. The B-29 that would drop the bomb was called Boxcar. Here's a picture of the crew in front of it. This picture here I took, this is the plane. It's in the Air Force Museum, Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. So my wife and I visited here. I took a lot of pictures. They have a lot of exhibits there, a lot of planes. And this is where they keep this bomb that dropped the second atomic bomb. Now the explosion killed 40,000 people. And you can see from the devastation here, it was just as bad as Hiroshima. This was a Catholic cathedral that was in Hiroshima, in Nagasaki, and the bomb exploded right above it. That's why you can see it's been almost totally destroyed. They would tear it down, and they did build a new one. It was one of the few Catholic cathedrals in Asia. They did rebuild it. This lucky city in Japan that morning was Kokura. Kokura was actually the target, but there was haze over the city, and they couldn't actually see it. So the B-29s went to their secondary target, which was Nagasaki. Now, there's a monument there that marks the hypocenter. This was ground zero of where the atomic bomb explosion was. It was actually exploded in the air above it. You can see off to the right here. That is one of the columns from the Catholic Cathedral. Pope Francis visited here last November, say a prayer and pray for peace, and he laid a wreath and lit a candle. All right, so VJ Day. The two atomic bombs did not kill as many as those that died in the firestorms of Tokyo, but it was only 2 planes. Actually, at the moment, we actually had to make more atomic bombs. Those are the only 2 we had, but the Japanese didn't know that, and we were saying we would just keep on dropping bombs and blowing up cities, and at this point, Japan knew they were in very big trouble. So Japan had a meeting, the top council had a meeting to decide whether to surrender or not, and as unbelievable as it seems, of the 6 people in that council, 3 of them voted to keep on fighting after seeing what happened in those 2 cities. The emperor, Hirohito, had to step in and break the tie, and he voted for surrender. There was a radio where he actually addressed the nation, which was kind of shocking since most people in Japan had never heard his voice. The Japanese emperors, they live a very secluded life. So on August 15th, Japan officially surrenders, and this is known as VJ Day, though it is a different day in Japan because of the timeline. September 2nd, the surrender terms were signed in Tokyo Harbor aboard the USS Missouri. That was one of our 4 newest battleships. It was a sister ship of the USS New Jersey. The Missouri was chosen because it was named after the home state of our President Harry Truman. So here we see, where is it? There it is, the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. All right, they're going to have the surrender. It's going to be up on the, this is the other side of the ship. It's going to be over on this side of this gun over here. Here are the Japanese delegation coming on board. And here's the official surrender. You see, here's Chester Nimitz, Admiral Chester Nimitz, signing the on behalf of the United States. Way behind him, back here, is Admiral Halsey and General Douglas MacArthur. And back here in the background are all members of different countries that fought against Japan: Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Great Britain. All the countries were involved, along a number of our top admirals in the war, all there to watch. The USS Missouri is still in Pearl Harbor. Is in Pearl Harbor today. It's not too far from the USS Arizona Memorial that we saw earlier in the year. If you go visit it like I did, along with my wife and our 2 nephews, my wife took this nice picture of us standing on this, right next to this plaque. Plaque marks the spot where the table was where they signed the surrender. So, and if you go inside, there's like a little museum, and you can see a reproduction. Actually, this was, I believe this was on a wall outside. You can see the sunlight. It was a reproduction of the surrender papers that were signed. Now, after the war, Tojo and many other top Japanese leaders were put on trial for war crimes. And some, like Tojo, were found guilty and executed. To the shock of a lot of people, Emperor Hirohito was not. He did give his, approval of the war, but many Americans, including Douglas MacArthur, rightfully realized that though the Japanese would probably be, upset or offended that Tojo might have been killed, but it would have destroyed any future trust we ever had with Japan if we hanged their emperor, who they considered divine. So to make sure that Japan will, our goal was to make Japan our ally, because we saw with Stalin who our future enemy might be. So we wanted to make sure the Japanese were on our side, and we weren't going to be able to do that if we hanged their divine emperor. So Hirohito will rule into the 1980s. All right, well, that's the end of the section. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. This also is our last section of the World War II class. So I hope you enjoyed it this year, and I hope you learned something about it. All right, thank you very much, and have a good day, and goodbye.